everybody. It is really good to see not you yet, maybe just your names, maybe your note takers, maybe just your image. But yeah, it really is wonderful to see everyone, and I'm really excited about our session today because it is a very interesting topic. And so with my welcome, and I will keep admitting people, so you'll keep seeing people join. And then, as you know, if you've been with us before, you'll join on mute. And then what we'll do is, after we've been able to hear from Zolani, then I will ask you to unmute those of you who would like to. And you can ask any questions you have or share any thoughts or ideas that you have. But I must say, for this session today, Zolani, I got lots of people saying, please send me a calendar invitation. Please send me a calendar invitation. I think, can I share this with my team? It's a very popular topic.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah. So welcome, Zolani, and welcome to everyone else, those who I know and those who I don't know. So for those who I do know, you'll know that I am Jane Moores, and I love working for myself under out-of-box thinking. And I spend most of my time training companies to attract and select the best people for their teams. I love my workshops. I love career coaching. And Zolani is somebody that I met at the recent annual cross-border tax faculty conference. I think I've got the name right because it's such a long name. Is that right, Zolani?
Yes,
And
yes.
we were both there in Cape Town, although he is sitting in Pretoria today, Chwane. And
Yes.
so we're happy to be able to have technology to connect us. So welcome, Zolani.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jane. It's such a pleasure to be here, and greetings to everyone that's currently on this video.
Awesome. Thank you. So I was very excited when Zolani said yes to joining our October masterclass, because as some of you know, we were in this conversation during the cross-border conference, and I was talking to him because I was currently facilitating one of my workshops for one of my clients, and we were in heated discussions when it comes to the topic of criminal records. And some people were saying, we really want to hire people who have a criminal record because we believe in supporting and rehabilitating people. And others were saying, oh, we don't want to, we're a bit nervous of it. And somebody was saying, oh, but we hired somebody recently and they had a criminal record as being part of an armed robbery. And then we found that they stole things. And Zolani said such an interesting point. He said, so were they the only ones stealing in the organization? And it was just one of those wonderful aha moments that I could continue to share with my workshops. And that was that there's a bias that comes when you hire somebody who has a criminal record. And how does that impact not just on your recruitment process, but also on that person's experience within the organization? So before we delve into the topic in more detail, I need to give you a long list of all Zolani's credentials because there are many. So he is, let me read them all off because I couldn't memorize them. He has a Master of Laws and Doctor of Philosophy degrees from Cape Town University, same as my university. And was also very fortunate to engage and be under Dennis Davis, Judge Dennis Davis, who's now retired, because Dennis also lectured us in jurisprudence at university. Such an amazing man, so bright. Oof. And he's a member of the Legal Compliance Committee. He's a founder at Ndiza Foundation, senior business rescue practitioner, chairperson of the Tax Appeals Board, and consultant to the African Tax Administration Forum. So that is a long list, Zolani. So please, can I ask that with that long list, please can you summarize what your main focus areas are at the moment? So we can really understand what you do.
Of course. Thanks once again, Jane. Maybe let me just give a personal dimension to Zolani. I'm originally born and bred in one of the townships of Cape Town. I was born and bred in the Langa township. I grew up there. I studied at, I was fortunate enough to have, have been given the opportunity to study at the University of Cape Town. I studied law. I'm a lawyer by profession. I specialize obviously in the areas of business risk and tax. I'm self-employed. I run a small outfit called BZ Attorneys, and I'm also the founder of a foundation called Ndiza Foundation, which I'll obviously unpack as the discussion goes forward. So in a nutshell, that's what I do. I'm self-employed, and then obviously the question of criminalization is a big one because it touches not just on the micro economic aspects such as your recruitment per se, but it touches on the broader issues such as inequality. And having been born, and grown up in the townships, I think that's inequality is a big thing, and it's something that's definitely close to my heart as well. And I've had the opportunity to see firsthand the effect of criminalization and the criminal justice system, and the effect that that's had in terms of marginalizing certain populations within society, and how that ultimately plays itself in from a micro perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that, Zolani, and thank you for bringing your personal experience and connection to this topic. And I think it's something that can be talked about theoretically, but it's very close to home for, I can't imagine who it's not close to home for, I must say, especially in South Africa. So when did you first start getting really interested in this topic, as in having a stance, having an opinion, wanting to get in and make a difference?
Yeah, I suppose having studied law, when you do your module of criminal law as part of your LLB, you taught that our legal system has basically two components. It's got the retributive component, which is the punishment for the crime, and then it's got the rehabilitative component, which is basically the assumption behind it is that once you've been punished, the criminal justice system is supposed to rehabilitate you so that you're able to be a productive member of society. So I think that's, that was one thing that stuck with me quite a bit, from a conceptual perspective. And I began to delve into it. And then obviously, having been born and having grown up in the townships, you start, standing at the coalface of people with criminal records. And then, I then discovered increasingly that a lot of people that had either been, incarcerated as kids or incarcerated as adults were faced with having, after post the punishment, and post the assumption of rehabilitation, those same individuals had to wait for a period of about 10 years before they could be eligible to apply for what is called expungement. So expungement, basically, what it basically means in short is that, you sort of apply for, if you have a criminal record, you wait for a period of 10 years, then you apply to the police headquarters in Pretoria for them to expunge your criminal record so that it doesn't appear as part of your profile from a criminal justice perspective. And when I noted the period of 10 years specifically, it hit me that it didn't make sense to me, in the sense that if there's an assumption of rehabilitation, then why do you have to wait for 10 years in order to be expunged? Because the net effect of that 10-year period is that it literally sterilizes the majority of South Africans from accessing opportunities because of the stigma that attaches to it. So really, that's where those conceptual underpinnings really took form and took root.
Yes, I can see how you were thinking about that deeply and thinking about the impact on people's lives and on their careers and on their choices.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you think about it as well, Jane, I mean, and this is not, it's not I don't think it's a sophist debate. I think it's a practical debate, because if you think about it, once you have a criminal record, you're quite limited in terms of your ability to be economically active. So what it essentially does, it at one end places you squarely at the economic periphery right? And then the immediate consequence of that is that you're then not able to be economically productive. And what it means for many people who offend and have the stigma of these records, and because of the economic profile of people who generally commit crime, they're then trapped in the cycle of reoffending. And that's where practical implication of that problem actually is.
Yes, I can see what you're saying.
Mm.
So, Zolani, at the moment, what does the law say about who companies can employ or can't employ from a legal perspective in South Africa? What is the current legislation?
Yeah, so you don't have specific legislation legislating against the employment of people with criminal records. But we do know that employers often do background checks, which is part of the due diligence processes, in determining or deciding whether to hire a recruit. And really it goes back to the point, whilst one understands the need for organizations to do that due diligence process, you've still got that view that a person who's been incarcerated has rehabilitated. So why is it relevant that they have a criminal record if the assumption is that they've been punished and rehabilitated for that? And secondly, when you look at, in my view, the whole framework around expungements, it's my honest view that it's an unfair limitation on the right to freedom of occupation, of trading an occupation, because what it essentially does is that it limits you from being able to acquire skills that you would have acquired, maybe let's say at your first job, in order for you to ultimately become economically active in the same way that you are, Jane, being self-employed and being a potential provider of employment for others. So whilst there isn't any legislative injunction on companies to engage in that process of due diligence, we've seen that candidates that have criminal records are less likely to be employed when compared to candidates who may not have a criminal record.
I think, what I see and what I hear and understand from my own experience in recruitment and from different companies going through that hiring process is that there are some crimes that weigh more heavily. And for example, a financial services company may have a service level agreement with their clients that includes their team that is going to service their client or their client's clients, not having any, for example, having a clear credit check or not having any judgments against them. So there's that may apply for that type of role or that type of organization that wouldn't necessarily apply in another role or another organization. So it seems like there's a variation of what is weighed more heavily when. And then it also seems like there are other records for other crimes, for example, murder, armed robbery, sexual offenders, and those apply from a more blanket perspective across organizations and across industries. So do you have any input, views on that, and what applies, what doesn't apply, what should apply, what shouldn't apply?
Yeah, look, I think you mentioned a very critical point, in the sense that I'll touch on the weighing of the crimes first. In the sense that not all crimes are equal. But what you find with the current system, number one, is that you get flagged and it says that you have a criminal record. It doesn't specifically say that you have a criminal record for shoplifting or criminal record for assault or criminal record for murder. You understand? So even though the potential employer has that information, the information is not helpful enough to be able to guide the potential employer into the psychology of the potential candidate. What it essentially does is that it just leaves the candidate with that stigma that they have, a criminal record. So in that sense, it's really not helpful if you think about it. And the second point on that particular layer is that the fact of the matter is that once you've waited for a period of 10 years, the potential employer doesn't have that information. And the question is, why do you have to wait for a period of 10 years? Why do you have to be economically limited for a period of 10 years? before you're able to have access to that particular opportunity. And to come to the second point that you make, and I agree with you 100%, because not all crimes are equally morally acceptable. For one, I'm a big proponent of sexual offences legislation, for example. I think that the Sexual Offences Bill is morally right. Number one, I think it's legally defensible, because what it essentially does is that it provides the potential employer with an indication, with an indication of the potential of the conduct that the person of sexual offender may have had. And I think particularly that would be relevant if someone applies to be a teacher, for instance, and teach to kids. I think that the school would have a very strong legal argument and moral argument to say, okay, look, we want to know whether this person's been convicted for a sexual offense. So I think there's a difference in from my perspective in terms of grading, in terms of sexual offences legislation and the sexual offenders register, right? Because if you're a sexual offender, you'll always be a sexual offender, because there's that moral element, which is quite distinct from the criminal element. Because what that also does, what the sexual offences register purports to do or seeks to do, is to protect the most vulnerable in society as well, which are women and children. So that sexual offences legislation and that register, I think it's very justifiable. It's legally, I think it's morally valid and legally justifiable. The point that I'm simply making is particularly within the purview of criminal offences, where the moral dynamics and the moral debate is slightly different.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're talking about society and building a healthy society and a healthy future for all. And the point that you're making speaks very clearly and directly to future generations. And so there is that very clear link, as you say, for example, a sexual offense and somebody who's in a role as a teacher. I think something that you said in the beginning is, and I do see clients battling with this, potential employers battling with this, is that they receive a record or an offense indication that there's an offense when they do their background checks or criminal checks. But now they have it and they don't have the detail around it. And what I see people wrestling with is, okay, maybe there was a situation where, this person was involved in an armed robbery or murder, homicide, whatever the case was, but it's very different if they were targeting their wife or girlfriend and intentionally going to kill that person, murder that person, as opposed to they were a young adult or young child caught up in a situation, didn't really know what was going on, and next thing they were arrested for something that they weren't even really aware of. So, what can companies do, Zolani, in your view, when they get records back, when they do their checks, and now they're stuck because a lot of them, they want to contribute to rehabilitation, but now they're also afraid of putting their employees at risk?
Yeah, but look, I think it's a very legitimate fear. But I don't know whether excluding people with previous criminal records is really the best way of addressing that fear, or the most effective way of addressing that fear. Because really what we must ask ourselves as well is that when the legislation was designed, what was the mischief that it sought to resolve? Why do you have legislation that says that you need to wait for 10 years? What happens after 10 years? Do you just, by the flicker of the switch, become a completely different individual? And I take the point that absolutely, clients might very well be sensitive and fears around certain attributes, or potential attributes that may be attributed to potential hires. But the problem with the point that I'm making is that the problem with the current system is that criminal record does not provide any intrinsic insights apart from stigmatizing. And we all know that the mere fact that one has a criminal record does not necessarily mean that person has the propensity to commit crime more than any other employee, unless if that person is an habitual criminal. So I really, I think it's just a balance that, the potential hirers of candidates need to factor in. But I think a lot of I think the challenge really needs to be dealt with at a very macro legal perspective, where there is a distinct challenge to the current framework. Because for me, Jane, really, I can't stress the point. I simply cannot understand what happens after the 10th year, right? What changes with that candidate after the 10th year? Whereas if you look at that same candidate and the exclusion that that candidate faces, the only effect or the impact or really the consequence of that exercise is that that candidate is more likely to reoffend, because that candidate does not have access to economic opportunity. And what does reoffending do? It perpetuates inequality and economic inequality, more specifically.
Yes, I hear you. And I hear the things that are kind of speaking louder to me as you're sharing is, firstly, as you've emphasized yourself, the 10 years. Why 10 years? You mentioned the word habitual, that there would be a difference between somebody who is an habitual offender as opposed to a single situation where something happened. And also the motivation behind that crime. If it was economically linked, then somebody not having economic means might mean that they are pushed towards that again. So it would also be the motivation that comes into play. But if we take that 10 years, which I hear you speak very passionately about, what would your advice or your recommendation be? If you would say, okay, let's redesign that. What would you do differently?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Jane. Look, I'll say that the 10-year period is very arbitrary. It's very arbitrary. I don't think that there's any scientific basis that supports a period of 10 years as opposed to a period of 5 years, or as opposed to a period of 3 years, or 40 years, or 50 years. I think that if as a society, and when you look at law as two-pronged, essentially, that one, you get punished for a crime that you commit, and number two, once punished for the crime, you rehabilitate. I see no reason why you should have to wait for 10 years. I see no reason why there should be a register which is accessible to potential employers, particularly in respect of people who may have had previous criminal records. Because apart from, I think the only insight that a potential employer is able to get from a previous criminal record is simply the number of times that person's been convicted. So if a person's been convicted, let's say 50 times, as opposed to another candidate who's been convicted once, or candidate that hasn't been convicted at all, you're probably likely to infer that the person who's been convicted 50 times is a habitual criminal. But I don't think that there's any intrinsic value from a decision-making process and from an in-depth decision process that you're actually able to get from the mere fact of having the information which says that this person has a criminal record, because you don't know which criminal record they have. You don't necessarily know for how long they've been sentenced. You've seen a lot of instances, particularly within the context of minors as well, where a person will have a criminal record but be released into the custody of their kids. So what does that tell us? You understand? Or even adults, where someone is arrested for drunk driving and enters into a plea deal. When that person applies for a job, it says that they have a criminal record. Does that mean that they're a hardcore criminal? So those are the dynamics, and for me, that's why my respectful view is that there is no intrinsic benefit that can be derived from that information by an employer.
So I suppose as an interviewer, what I usually look at is what is coming forward, what is in my view, what is in my sense, what is evidence. And that for me is an indication that I need to dig deeper and find out what is true evidence, what has predictive value, And what could simply be my own bias.
Absolutely.
And perhaps my bias is a negative bias and it might stand in the way of really hiring good people. And I do see that tension in companies with hiring managers saying, there are some people who I really want to hire, but I'm not allowed to because of our policy, which states that I can't hire somebody who has, whose credit record is not clean. But here I have someone who went through a messy divorce, or here I have someone who hasn't been working. And so it's not their fault that they have these marks against them, but now I can't hire them and I'm missing out on that. So I think, as you say, it's so important to dig deeper and find out what is behind what I'm seeing, what evidence is coming forward for me. And I'm wondering whether you've come across any companies or even other countries where people have tried to bring rehabilitation processes into their hiring process. Have you seen anything that could be best practice or that works in your view?
No, look, I haven't seen anything specifically, but what I can say is that what we currently doing as the foundation, through the foundation, is that we have initiated a process of, to challenge the constitutionality of that 10-year expungement period. Because really, we really believe that it doesn't have any intrinsic value apart from perpetuating inequality and ultimately leading to reoffending. And we're quite careful as well in that, in the litigation itself, not to touch your sexual offences legislation, because obviously that's another can of worms, and we don't necessarily want to get embroiled in political debates and so I think from where I'm standing, I completely understand the position that the employer might be in. But I think there's a level of cognizance that the employer needs to exercise. And it might be the case that a lot of employers are not exercising that level of cognizance because it's an employer's market. And that's an exact result of the high inequality that you face in the country as well, which is as a result of the high inequality of the country as well. So a lot of this is quite cyclical. And if you really look at it, it tends to feed in a particular direction. So I think it's quite incumbent on employers to really assess the recruitment processes, assess why they're adopting certain processes and whether there's any intrinsic value for the ultimate client that may be derived from their processes. I made an example with someone who's been arrested for drunk driving. When you're potentially considering that applicant, does the drunk driving conviction mean that that person is more likely to drink on the job as opposed to any other candidate? It doesn't really tell you anything. So I think a lot of these issues, obviously there is scope for employers to exercise their discretion and obviously the decision making in a more fuller sense, in a more considered sense as well. But I obviously think that there's a greater need for legislative intervention and change.
I must say, I do see whenever I ask companies whether their current employees have background checks conducted on them while they are already in the employ of the company, they say no. So it's really just the candidates who have that background check performed. And once they're in the job, they could be, as you say, I'm sure it would come up, but yeah, there isn't that consistency in monitoring people's backgrounds.
Yes.
Something you mentioned around the 10 years, I think when we look at a competency-based approach to recruitment, the old view used to be that you are competent in something if you've done it for a certain number of years, instead of looking at the quality of that person's performance and output during the time that they were employed. And so I think what you're saying around the number of years makes sense from that perspective, where it would be helpful. I don't know whether they look at it as well, but it's not just a time frame. It's what was the behavior like within that time frame, long or short. So it really is difficult. And I think another challenge is it's time consuming. Often recruiters and companies are in a hurry. They need to get people in. There's a strain, there's a workload. And so doing all of these checks and doing them in detail, especially in South Africa where there are so many applicants, perhaps, really,
Absolutely.
yeah, becomes impractical from their perspective. So it's very difficult.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you think about it, Jane, as well, I mean, there's always the assumption that, someone who's criminally convicted is a direct participant in the crime. I mean, I've come across situations or instances where, a youngster, gets into a car that's driven by guys from a township, from his particular township, all to find that that's a stolen car. And that
Right.
and that youngster is convicted on the basis of common purpose.
Yeah,
You know what I
exactly.
mean? So, you know what I mean? So really, because the criminal justice system itself has a number of challenges which are skewed, against people of a certain population size and economic means. So what you then see happening is that it's almost as if, the same people are then marginalized throughout, and then they are the feeders for the same system that keeps them marginalized. And those are the ones that, where the most violence happens, where the most inequality is prevalent, and they sort of feed into the system. And to the point that you're making, I mean, if you think about it really, then, if you conduct those checks on people coming in only, does that mean is it not a form of gatekeeping then? You know, if you think about it. So for me, it tells me that an employer is saying if you've sort of been able to make it through and make it in, you're good to go. But if you do not meet the initial criteria, you stay out. And there's nothing scientific about that, in my view, when I assess it. Because really, recruitment and criminal records should be part of a number of factors or matrices that employers should be considering, and not necessarily even the most weighty in that assessment. But what you see in practice is that if someone has a criminal record, no one engages in that in-depth assessment, perhaps maybe due to the lack of time resources, and the candidate is simply excluded by virtue of that singular fact.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's complicated and it definitely is not, yeah, it's not a siloed conversation, as you say, it links in with everything,
Absolutely.
social, economic, all of those factors. So
Yeah.
Zolani, you've spoken about the pros of hiring people who have a criminal record from a rehabilitation perspective and from furthering and growing the economy, reducing inequality. Yeah, are there any other benefits or reasons to hire? If you were in a debate and you were saying, I'm debating that we should hire people with criminal records.
Yeah.
What are
I
the
mean,
arguments or thoughts that you
yeah,
have for that?
I think maybe the one that brings to mind, most loudly for me, you can't have true rehabilitation if you don't have integration, right? So potential offender is most likely to offend if that particular individual has not been integrated fully into society as an active member of society. So I think it's a big component that potential employers sort of miss in that recruitment process. And obviously we do understand that there's certain biases and certain fears. Whether those are reasonable or logical is something else. But I think integration in society and economic integration is probably the one way in which we'll be able as a country and as a society to fix some of the challenges that we're currently facing. And by keeping that sense of exclusion, exclusion to opportunity, you sort of then, feeding the loop back in again, which creates a lot of these challenges that we're always lamenting, from a societal perspective. So I think employers have a distinct opportunity by, to create opportunities at integration for candidates that may have criminal records, because not all criminal records, not all crimes are the same, and not all circumstances which result in ultimately in a conviction are the same. I mean, we come across instances all the time where someone may have committed the offense, but because of financial resources, that person is able to escape liability, culpability for that
Yeah,
particular crime.
yeah.
So if you flip it backwards as well, that person who may have committed the crime, who may have committed an egregious crime, doesn't face the same level of economic and social exclusion, that a person who's probably most likely less healed will face.
Yeah, absolutely. It actually reminds me, Zolani, I must tell you a funny / not so funny story about when I was consulting to a company and they did background checks for the financial management role that they were recruiting for. And something kept showing up on this person's background, but it wasn't clear what it was. And the recruitment consultancy wasn't forthcoming until the day that this person arrived at the company in Cape Town. The person had come from Johannesburg. And the new financial manager was at reception. And at that moment, a call came through from the recruitment consultancy saying, actually, what it showed up is that it was fraud. And so when I spoke to, because I was the person designated to welcome this new financial manager, and I said, welcome, and I do need to raise something that has just come through, and is that your criminal record check shows that there is fraud. And he said, he looked so confused and frustrated, and he looked at me and he said, but I paid for that to go away. It was a failed attempt. I don't know if you paid, but it didn't work in that sense. But I think, Zolani, what you're saying about the integration is so important. And we talk a lot about diversity and equity and inclusion. And from that perspective, there's a saying that it's one thing to be invited to the party, it's another to be asked to dance.
Yeah.
And so even saying, okay, we will include somebody who has a criminal record in the organization is one thing. But then when that person is in the organization, how is that person treated by those who are aware of that person's background and, whatever records are there? Is that person treated with trust? Are they invited to dance, or are they just there and treated with a bit of suspicion? Because as you say, with this other company, it wasn't only the person who had the armed robbery record that was the one stealing. Stock was being stolen by everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people who didn't have a record.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it goes to the point that I've mentioned. To say, okay, look, what is the intrinsic value of that information? I suppose with example that you make regarding the financial manager, there may be very valid moral and other reasons to say, if you've been convicted of fraud, then you can't occupy
Yes, absolutely.
role.
Yeah.
But what happens when
Relates to the job.
It relates directly to the job, but then equally, once that person is able, reaches the 10-year mark, that person is able to, let's say the person comes from a well-off family and runs a family business for the 10 years, and then after, on the 11th year, applies for expungement and gets the job. What is the value of the 10 years? What has the 10 years prohibited? And really, that's the thing, even for the example of the financial manager individual, right? If you take that same example, are you saying now that that particular individual now is fit and proper and ready to occupy that position? Are they fit because of the 10 years? Does that mean that they're not going to do anything of the sort again? What is it about 10 years? I mean, what is it about 10 years?
Yeah.
So it's I suppose it's just one of those aspects that and as you mentioned quite aptly earlier, it's really a balancing exercise, I think. Because equally, as shareholders would not be comfortable knowing that, financial manager is literally the wolf that, it eats the chickens, the hen's eggs, as it were. Because that really there's a correlation between that person's position and between that and the offense for which that person's been convicted.
No,
so it's
sure.
not an easy one. So it's not an easy one. I agree with you 100%.
No, it isn't easy. There are arguments both sides, and I know we've spoken a lot about, okay, what are the pros for digging deeper, for really understanding why, for helping with rehabilitation and integration. And I know it's not your nature and it's not your argument, but you are also saying in some cases there would be reasons why you should not hire somebody who has a criminal record. So if you were to take a stance now on the other side and say, okay, I'm actually going to say that companies should not hire somebody who has a criminal record when or if ... What would those reasons be?
That's a difficult one, but
It's very
remember,
difficult for you.
yeah, to be
And
honest,
I'm sure for many, but yeah, what are the possible pitfalls? What should people watch out for? Because I think people genuinely do want to participate in rehabilitation and support that, but they're afraid. And so sometimes a kind of clear guideline or okay, here's when I shouldn't feel so bad about excluding someone. It's when...
I suppose, and this is probably an imperfect answer. I suppose you wouldn't want, a primary school wouldn't want to hire a pedophile.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back to my point regarding sexual offenses, right? Because of the
Yeah.
nature and the egregious nature of those offenses, and really those are offenses of power, right? Many of them, particularly offenses, that relate to women, the elderly, and children. The perpetrators often, they commit those crimes out of power. It would be very difficult to argue that those crimes are committed for economic reasons. So I would, in such an instance, I would say, okay, look, and that's really why I would say that a sexual offenders list is probably a great idea, and considering whether a candidate is on that sexual offenders list as a weighty factor would probably be a good idea, because those crimes go into the psychology of the perpetrator, and the power dynamics and the psychology of power that perpetrator may have. And I don't know whether it's easy to rehabilitate someone like that in comparison to someone who's caught for shoplifting, or someone who's arrested for drunk driving, or someone who's arrested for, a robbery that turned sour, where they stabbed or shot someone. I think, and maybe that's just my personal bias, but I think that there's a distinction to be drawn in those particular instances, because it goes to questions of psychology and power, and the psychology of the perpetrator, which ultimately feeds into the questions whether the perpetrator is capable of being rehabilitated. In the same way that I think it would be of intrinsic value if you pull out the record and you discover that this person is a serial robber or habitual criminal. I think you could get some form of intrinsic value from that. And that's why we've argued in our application, an application that we in the process of drafting, that it's our view that people should be expunged, in the sense that the criminal convictions should not necessarily be available to the public, but we think that those should be available for the purposes of sentencing. So if someone commits a further crime, then the court is able to consider whether that person is a serial or habitual criminal. And I think that's where those information surrounding the nature of the crime and the nature of conviction should actually factor in. I.e., where the person actually finds themselves at the coalface of the law again.
So the nature of the crime, the nature of the conviction, the why behind it, the link to the role itself and the relevance in that context, the amount of time allowed for rehabilitation as opposed to how the person has changed. Is that determined by time, or what other factors, or is it an and, or is it an or? And I hear you saying that this cannot be a standalone topic once again, because we're referring to psychology, to society, to economics. And so it requires a number of expertise views to come into play to be able to give a fair view and to be able to make a fair assessment. And so I think in interviews, as in any interview, it's always important to dig deeper. It's almost important to look for valid evidence, try and get past the bias, ask about the why. And so there is a lot to be discussed and wrestled with on this topic, Zolani, and so much more to be explored. So for people who want to find out more about this topic or more about what you're doing, what would you recommend? Who could they speak to? Which resources are available?
Yeah, look, we are running the project that I mentioned. It's under the banner called Decriminalize Our Youth.
Mm-hmm.
Currently in the process of drafting papers. You can check out our LinkedIn page, Lisa Foundation LinkedIn page. We'll keep everyone abreast in terms of progress.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of in terms of the litigation.
Mm-hmm.
If someone wants to, get in touch with me, I see that you've shared my LinkedIn page as well. More
Mm-hmm.
than happy to have a chat, around some of the aspects and issues that we've discussed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah,
thank you. I really do appreciate that, Zolani, and I so appreciate you sharing with us today. It clearly is a topic that is very close to your heart, right from when you grew up and how you grew up and what you've seen in South Africa and what you've studied. So I know it's one conversation, but there are years of experience and thinking and discussions that feed into this. And we so appreciate you sharing your valuable time with us. Thank you. And thank you for saying that people can contact you if they'd like to learn more. So
no,
yeah, please do
absolutely.
connect with Zolani if you'd like to, and please do connect with me on LinkedIn too. We're always running our monthly masterclasses on the second last Wednesday of every month. So yeah, it's wonderful to have everyone here.